On August 9th, 1965, a man stood in front of the cameras and wept. Not out of joy, not from relief. He wept because his country had just been thrown out, kicked out of Malaysia, separated from its economic hinterland overnight. No natural resources, no farmland, no oil, no fresh water, not even enough food to feed its own people. This man, Kuan, had just inherited an island the size of a city, crammed with 3 million people, where 70% lived in overcrowded slums. Unemployment was running at 14%, and half the population couldn't read. He looked straight into the camera and said, "This is a moment of anguish." Most economists looked at Singapore in 1965 and wrote it off. No resources, no hinterland, no army, no reason to exist. And yet, 60 years later, Singapore has a higher income per capita than the United States. It runs the busiest port on Earth. It has a AA credit rating, the only Asian country with that stamp from all three major agencies. And it built all of this with basically nothing. This is the story of the most improbable economic miracle of the 20th century. Let's be honest about how bad it was. Singapore in 1965 wasn't just poor. It was structurally poor in a way that seemed almost impossible to fix. The economy ran on two things: the British naval base and entrepot trade, basically acting as a middleman, shipping rubber and tin through the port. That was it. Then, almost immediately, both legs got kicked out. Malaysia cut off Singapore's access to its common market. Gone. Indonesia, a key trading partner, had a political falling out and stopped trading. Gone. And then, in 1968, Britain announced it was shutting down its military base. That base alone was responsible for 20% of Singapore's entire workforce. You can imagine the feeling. You've just been told you don't have a country anymore, and then the biggest employer in that country packs up and leaves. So what do? You get creative, fast. Kuan and his deputy Goh Keng Swee, the man who'd later be called the architect of Singapore's economy, made a decision that went against almost every economic theory popular at the time. In the 1960s, the fashionable playbook for newly independent developing nations was protectionism. Build walls, keep foreign companies out, grow your own industries, be self-reliant. Singapore looked at that playbook and threw it in the bin. Instead, they went the other way. Completely, almost aggressively, open. They invited multinational corporations in, American ones, European ones, Japanese ones. They slashed red tape. They kept taxes low. They built industrial estates almost overnight. Goh Keng Swee put it simply: Singapore's industries had to produce goods not for the domestic market, which was far too small, but for the world market. This sounds obvious now, but in 1965, it was radical. The first big win came in 1968 when Texas Instruments, yes, that Texas Instruments, opened a semiconductor factory in Singapore. Semiconductors, high-tech manufacturing, on an island with a mostly illiterate workforce just 3 years earlier. It was a signal, a loud one, and the multinationals started to listen. By 1972, just 7 years after independence, more than a quarter of all manufacturing firms in Singapore were foreign-owned or joint ventures. Employment in manufacturing grew over 50% in just 3 years. Unemployment fell from nearly 15% to under 5%, 12.7%. That was Singapore's average annual GDP growth from 1965 to 1973. For context, China during its economic miracle in the 1980s averaged about 10%. Singapore did it faster. Here's the thing about economic booms. Lots of countries have them. Oil is discovered. A trade route opens up, foreign money floods in, and then it evaporates. Because the boom was never really built on anything. Singapore was different, because alongside the growth, the government was quietly doing 3 things that would make it last. Pillar 1, make the place safe to invest in. Corruption was zeroed out, not reduced, zeroed out. Singapore became one of the least corrupt countries on Earth, and it did it deliberately, systematically, and harshly. Kuan was unapologetic about this. He understood that every dollar lost to corruption was a dollar that would have otherwise built trust with investors. And trust, for a tiny island with no oil, was the only resource that actually mattered. The rule of law was ironclad. Contracts were enforced. Property rights were respected. You want to know the single most boring sentence that explains Singapore's success? Here it is. Investors knew their money was safe. That's it. That's a huge part of the secret. Pillar 2. Invest everything in the people. Singapore had no oil, no iron ore, no coal, no farmland, but it had people. And Lee Kuan Yew treated human capital like it was the most precious natural resource on Earth. Because for Singapore, it literally was. Education spending exploded. Technical colleges were built. Multinationals were specifically required to train local workers in high-skilled trades, electronics, medicine, aerospace. The idea was simple. Bring the companies in today, sure, but make sure that in 20 years, Singaporeans are running those industries themselves. Pillar 3. The government was genuinely good at its job. This is the uncomfortable one. Singapore didn't succeed despite its government. It succeeded largely because of it. Lee's administration was authoritarian in ways that are genuinely troubling. Press freedom was suppressed. Political opposition was crushed. Civil liberties were curtailed. These are real costs. Real people paid them. But, and this is important to understand, within that system, the economic governance was exceptional. Civil servants were paid competitively to reduce the temptation of bribes. Decisions were made quickly and with a long time horizon. The government wasn't chasing re-election cycles. It was building a 50-year plan. The National Wages Council, a table where unions, employers, and government sat together, quietly resolved labor disputes that might have derailed other countries. No strikes, no capital flight, just grinding, unglamorous cooperation. By the late 1970s, Singapore had essentially won the first race. Unemployment was low, infrastructure was built. People had jobs and homes. And then Lee Kuan Yew did something almost no developing country has ever done. He deliberately made Singapore more expensive. Wages were raised, aggressively. The low-skill, low-cost manufacturing that had saved Singapore in the 1960s, they started pushing it out. Why? Because they wanted to force Singapore up the value chain. Low-cost t-shirt factories moving to Indonesia or Malaysia was the plan. Singapore wanted to become the place where the high-value work happened. Finance, biomedical research, aerospace engineering, oil refining. It didn't always go smoothly. Singapore hit a recession in 1985 when the strategy misfired temporarily. They recalibrated, adjusted wages, brought in consultants. Yes, they hired an external review. Lee's team wasn't too proud to admit when something wasn't working. That flexibility, the willingness to change course, is underrated. Most governments, once they've staked their ego on a policy, can't let go. Singapore could. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was $516. Today, roughly $88,000, one of the highest in the world. That's a roughly 170-fold increase in real terms in about 60 years. To put that in perspective, the United States, in the same period, roughly tripled its per capita income. The UK roughly doubled it. Singapore did 170 times. Over 3,000 multinational companies operate there now. It's the world's busiest container port. It ranks number 1 on virtually every business environment index that exists, and it has virtually no natural resources. Milton Friedman, the economist who basically wrote the book on free markets, called it the perfect example of how to do development right. Every few years, a developing country announces it wants to be the next Singapore, and almost none of them manage it. Which raises the question, what actually happened here? And can anyone else do it? The honest answer is, probably not exactly like this. Singapore's success required a very specific combination of things. A strategic location at the world's busiest shipping lane. A particular historical moment where export-led manufacturing was just beginning to globalize. A leader with both the vision and the political control to execute a 30-year plan without interruption. Take away any one of those factors, and the story looks very different. The things that can be replicated? Good governance, real anti-corruption, investment in education, openness to trade, treating foreign investors like they matter. Those things aren't unique to Singapore. They're just hard. They require patience, and they require leaders who are willing to make decisions that pay off in 20 years, not in the next election cycle, which, if you look around the world right now, is still pretty rare.
In August 1965, Lee Kuan Yew stood in front of the cameras and wept. He said he never wanted Singapore to be separate from Malaysia. He said he had spent years trying to make the merger work. He said this was the worst day of his life. And then, and this is the part that matters, he got up. He went to work. He assembled a team. He made hard choices. He built institutions. He played a very long game. Today, Singapore is ranked the #1 place in the world to do business. It has more Nobel Prize-winning researchers per capita than almost any other country. Its passport is one of the most powerful on Earth. And it built all of it on a tiny, resource-barren island, starting with absolutely nothing, except the decision to try anyway.